Today we are going to be exploring the myth of Orpheus and the mysteries of Eleusis in the ancient world. They are mysteries of descent about the theme of paradox and the search for the feminine. They connect to our story from last week when we explored this monumental work by Raphael that is in the Room of the Signature in the Vatican Museum. This painting is itself a portrayal of paradox with two seeming opposites, Aristotle and Plato, walking straight down the middle. And we talked last week about the great figure of Pythagoras, that sage who was simultaneously a scientist and a mathematician and a profound mystic who introduced the rules and the logic of the theory of music and its theoretical construction as a pathway to opening up communion with the divine. We talked about his search for the logos, the search for this underlying pattern that permeates all creation and how it could be seen in music and mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. And that part of the Pythagorean philosophy is this idea that everything emerges out of a holding of the tension of the opposites. That tension geometrically was symbolized by these two overlapping circles that create this symbol known as the Vesica Piscis, a symbol from which we get the symbol of the ichthys, or the fish, that becomes the dominant symbol in Christianity for Jesus, who was the paradox of fully human and fully divine, a child who was born of a virgin, begotten by a god. Talk about paradox. And so we still see this ichthys symbol. You can even see it there on cars going by with the word Jesus inside of it. But it came from this Pythagorean community of Greek philosophy talking about how do we find the divine? We find it as human beings by managing somehow to hold this tension of the opposites. Today, we're going to be exploring then some of the mysteries and the myths that are all about this tension of the opposites, in which communion and union with the divine was sought through an experience that would transcend your human limitations. I love it that the word that's most often used to describe me is enthusiastic. And I love that because the Greek word enthusiasm actually is a word that relates to the Greek god Dionysus. In Greek, it was entheos, to be filled with the spirit of the divine. To be infused with God was to be enthusiastic. And then enthusiasm was a sign of coming alive with the spiritual realms. And we're going to see that that was what was sought in these Eleusinian mysteries and these Orphic mysteries, was to find a connection to the divine and to one another in a community by having an experience that would take you out of your normal boundaries of rational thought. As part of that process, music was an integral part, music to heal you and to make you whole. But the journey was fraught with this paradox. Before you could ascend into the realms of joy, first you had to descend into the depths of the underworld. Before you could have this experience of spiritual rebirth, you first had to have the experience of death and dismemberment. And in that cycle was a whole making that would bring you fully alive as a human being. And in that cycle, fully alive, you would suddenly go out of yourself to transcend your human limitations. And it was that was sought in these mysteries. Now, we've spoken from our first class about the great ancient sibyls of the ancient world, the female oracular prophetesses, and how one of them was the Pythia, and that the word Pythia actually is at the root of Pythagoras' name. They both come from Python. And the Pythia was the great oracle who presided at the shrine at Delphi. And Delphi was the most extraordinary site where people would go on pilgrimage to seek profound learning, to have transcendent wisdom enter. And one of the things that made Delphi so interesting is that it held the tension of the opposites. There were two statues. It was the site of two gods. It's the only one that I know that was a shrine to two gods in Greece, not one. And those two gods were diametrical opposites. On the one hand was the god of Apollo, who was the god of reason, rationality, order, balance. And on the other hand, on the other side of this building was a statue of Dionysus, who was the god of wild, intoxicated energy, whose myths are all about losing control rather than having control and restraint. Apollo was the god of the sun. Dionysus was the god of the moon. Apollo had these nice, ordered buildings that were filled with regular columns in the city. Dionysus's rituals were by night underneath the moon, and they were raw and savage in the woods. They were about as opposite as two forces energetically could possibly be. And at Delphi then were both statues. And it was said that Apollo was in residence for 9 months out of the year. And then Dionysus was in residence for 3 months out of the year. And they had a timeshare at Delphi. A timeshare at Delphi. And there in the building where supplicants would enter was inscribed on the walls the maxim that the oracle was supposedly had said to Socrates when he arrived, "Know thyself and never leave the middle." So I invite you to consider what that means. If that's in the middle between Apollo and Dionysus, it's a mirror to you to know the Apollo within yourself, the rational part, and to know the Dionysian, ecstatic, irrational part, and somehow, like Plato and Aristotle walking through that school of Athens painting, somehow never leave the middle, be joined one to the other, side by side. And I invite you to consider what that means in your own life. So this is the backdrop for the Orphic mysteries. Because Orpheus, as we're going to see, is the mythical figure and the historical religion that attempts to bring together these two polarities, this idea of the tension of the opposites. This is one of the symbols that we have of the great Orphic religions. You'll see it's a dark egg encircled by a serpent. And in their story of the cosmos, the world begins in darkness and in night, in chaos. And there is this cosmic egg that begins dark and begins to glow hotter and hotter and becomes red. And as it does so, it breaks the bounds of the serpent. And from the shattered egg emerges all the life force of the cosmos. The great god of Eros, the energy of all that is in the life force, comes out, and from Eros are begotten all of the other gods. I want you to hold on to this symbol, to pay attention closely to it. The story begins with the serpent and ends with new life emerging out of a red egg. File that away. So the Orphic cosmology was actually looking at the story of Dionysus, and they envisioned a newer, complex layering of what was a very, very ancient god. And in the Orphic religious view, there were actually the figure of Dionysus that's called Dionysus the thrice born. The thrice born. In this myth, The first birth of Dionysus happens when the Greek goddess Persephone is in a cave. And the Greek god, Zeus, comes to her in the guise of a snake. You can see his tail here in this painting. And he impregnates her. And from that union comes the first Dionysus. Now, baby Dionysus is born, and Zeus's wife, Hera, is understandably a little disturbed by this. She's not very happy that once again her husband is cavorting out and begetting other children. And she is enraged, and she has an idea up her sleeve that she is going to trick little baby Dionysus, and that there's a way then that she is going to get rid of him. And the way that she tricks him is that she allures him by these playthings, by these toys. And he starts to play with them, and he gets distracted. And then the Greek titans, these sort of monstrous figures, descend upon little baby Dionysus, and they rip him apart. They rip him apart. He's dismembered. Well, Zeus gets so angry, he takes his mighty thunderbolt and he zaps those titans, and they are reduced to ash. Now, there's one thing that's left of baby Dionysus. It's his heart. It's his heart. Now, this turns into a potion that is given to a mortal woman. That mortal woman in the mythology is known as Semele. And Zeus comes to Semele, a mortal woman, and begets Dionysus a second time from the heart. It's like a little potion, imagine, if you will, that she's going to have this potion and drink it. And she becomes pregnant. And once again, Hera gets word. And she's very crafty. Hera is a very crafty goddess. And she is immortal, but Semele is very human, all human. So she sidles up to Semele and she says, "You don't know Zeus the way that I know Zeus. You haven't really experienced my husband the way that I have." And Semele gets a little envious and says, "Well, what do you mean?" And she says, "Well, you know, sweetheart, I know you've had your things with my husband, but he hasn't shown himself to you in his full glory." And Semele starts to get very ambitious. I want to have the experience of this goddess. So she goes to Zeus and essentially says, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Of course I love you, darling." "Well, if you love me, you'll do something for me." "I'll do anything you want, darling." And so she says, "Good. Show yourself to me in your full glory." Bad idea. Bad idea. If you look at any of the myths, if you look at the myth, for example, even Moses cannot look on the face of God and live. So this idea, we cannot behold face to face the divine. It shatters us. And he tries everything he can to talk Semele out of this very bad idea. And she insists, and it's too late because he's given his word. As a God, you can't undo your word. So he comes to her in his full glory. And he overshadows her. And this cloud comes, and she can't stand it. She is reduced to ash. Now, before she dies completely, though, they grab the baby out of the uterus. So now it's born a second time, baby Dionysus, but it's premature. And so what they do is they take Zeus and Hermes take baby Dionysus and they slap him in Zeus's own thigh and sew him up for the last bit. It's like a little incubator. And he stays there for the last bit of his gestation. And then he's born a third time. This is the scene from Moreau where Semele can't stand it anymore and she's being overshadowed. And then here in this Greek vase, you can see that little head emerging from the thigh. There's Zeus with Hermes with his staff and his hat, and little baby Dionysus going into the thigh so that he'll be able to survive. And here now he's full grown, so he can come out of the thigh and he's born again. And in this story then, to hide baby Dionysus away so that he'll be safe this time, so that Hera won't find him, Hermes takes him and hides him away, dressed as a little girl, where he spends his childhood on Mount Nyssa, on Mount Nyssa, with the Muses. And he grows up here. The Roman name for Dionysus is Bacchus. And he's surrounded by women. And he lives in the forest, and they play the drums and the pipes, and they dance and they cavort. And he has a foster father named Silenus, who's the patron saint of wine, who gives him wine to drink. And together they tend the vineyards. And so you have little baby Dionysus, or baby Bacchus, with all of the grape leaves around his head. And his companions then are the wild things. You will find Dionysus on the backs of leopards and wild animals, often with leopard skin. And notice here what they're carrying on those long sticks. Their heads. Their heads. Because in the mythology of the ancient Greeks, if you don't allow some of the wildness into your life, you will go crazy. You will go insane. You will lose your head. You actually have to have a little bit of insanity to stay sane, is part of the mythology of Dionysus. So we have some fascinating myths, stories. Euripides has a play about this called the Bacchae, in which if you don't allow Dionysus to come into your life, there are very, very, very bad things that will happen to you. So this is one story that's the backdrop of the Orpheus myth. A story of wildness, dismemberment, darkness, craziness, and that's part of what Dionysus, the Greek god, represents, is the intoxication of the spiritual life, of getting drunk with enthusiasm. Now, there's this other story that we have to connect to this. That is the story of Persephone, his first mother, right? And in the mythology of Persephone, we find many of these similar themes. Persephone was the young and beautiful daughter, and she and her mother Demeter, they were just such a tender, loving pair, the two of them. And it was just the sweetness. I have a daughter that I adore, so I very much identify with this sense of just being completely wrapped up in one another, of just cherishing one another. And one day, Persephone was out with her maiden companions, and she was out in a meadow. And she saw this beautiful narcissus flower, and it called her attention, and she went to go pick it. And this particular narcissus had very deep roots, and so she yanked it from the earth. And emerging out of that hole from the earth was the Lord of the underworld, Hades. And he came riding his chariot with his wild stallions, and he swept her off, and he took her and descended into the underworld. Now, there are some extraordinary sculptures by Bernini of this. This is in Rome. It is the most amazing. If you ever get to Rome, you must promise me you'll go to Villa Borghese and see this, because it is truly one of the most astonishing things you will ever see in your life. And in it is the abduction of Persephone here by Hades. And what you will see when you look at this, look at that! Can you believe that was done with marble? The way that his fingers are going into this. So this is the inspiration for some of the most astonishing art in all of Italy, is this scene of abduction. And according to the myth, Hades takes her deeply into the underworld. And her mother, Demeter, is distraught. She is searching all over the world, having no idea, where is my daughter? Where is my daughter? Where can she be? And nobody on the world, on the earth, has any idea. And she's so upset that as the goddess of crops, she lets all the crops wither. So the harvest is dying, the fields are dying, people are in danger of starving, and they don't have the oblations anymore that they used to have for the gods. So finally, she's told that her daughter is in the underworld after this long search. Beautiful, gorgeous story about her search to find her missing beloved daughter. Finally, she is told that Hades, Lord of the underworld, has her. And she goes down, and Hermes helps her find. You can see Hermes with his little winged hat here. Hermes is the god that still lives. He is, when you go to FTD Florist, that's Hermes, the messenger god, the one who delivers things. So he's the go-between, between the worlds. So Hermes is able to descend into the underworld. And they find her again, and she's reunited with her mother. And then they ask the feared questions. Darling, did you eat anything while you were down in the underworld? And it turns out that she had. She had eaten some seeds from a pomegranate. From a pomegranate. Now, according to the different region in the Mediterranean, she ate either 3 to 6 seeds. That is actually a relationship to how long the winters were. Because the mythology comes in such a way that what happens is that Persephone spends some of the year with her mother. And when she's with her mother, Demeter is happy and she lets the crops grow and there's flowers in the field and life is wonderful. But then there comes the time where she has to honor the fact that she ate those seeds in the underworld and descend down underneath the earth where she is the bride of Hades. So Persephone has this paradoxical life. Some of the time she is the young maiden in the meadow. Some of the time she is the bride in the underworld as the queen of the underworld married to Lord Hades. And the life of ancient Greece then measured the seasons according to this myth. And fall would begin when Persephone would be making her descent into the underworld. And spring would happen in March as Persephone and her candle emerged from the underworld. And there were celebrations then to commemorate this cycle of life. And it's related in profound and deep ways to this myth. I want you to notice something. I want you to notice the theme of how the idyllic world filled with a garden is lost because of the eating of a fruit. Now, when the Hebrew Bible was translated into more northern European countries, they didn't have the tree of what the fruit originally was. Pomegranate means apple of Granada. Oh, think about that. So Persephone then is this queen of the underworld, and we see these images of her on this throne that's like a throne of wisdom. We've seen thrones of wisdom before when we looked at Isis, for example. So here is Persephone as the queen of the underworld who knows the world of darkness, but who also knows the world of light, going back and forth between those two, who is simultaneously maiden and bride at the same time. At the same time. Now, Orpheus comes in, and he's one of these figures that is very slippery to pin down because there's the mythic Orpheus. There may have been a historical person named Orpheus as well. And then there's the Orphic religion, and those get very complicated. What makes it even more complicated, folks, is a number of scholars think that the Orphic religion was actually an invention of Pythagoras. Oh, so there's these fascinating currents that are very hard to disentangle, and we're just going to let them wash over us right now. But just to know that it's there. And in this story, Orpheus, in the mythic story, Orpheus is the son of Apollo, the god of the sun, the god of light, the god of rationality, the god of mathematics and logic. But Orpheus is also the son of Calliope, one of the muses. And he is born in the Rhodope Mountains of Bulgaria. Now this is very interesting because this is the land that Dionysus is always said to have come from. He's always from the east. The Dionysian worship was here in these very wild mountains there, where they still have elements of Dionysian rites and festivals to this day. And this is where Orpheus's literal grave is supposed to be, is right here. So this is interesting. Son of Apollo, but born in the land that's associated with Dionysus. Now, the myth of Orpheus, then, is that he is the first musician, that he brings music to humanity, that Apollo gives him his lyre. Lyre, like a harp, was the instrument. The strings were the instrument of Apollo. So here is Orpheus playing his lyre. And in some versions, that gets translated in more modern times. We don't usually play lyres these days, although there's a resurgence of that. But in the 19th century, Orpheus was seen as playing a stringed instrument, most often a cello, a viola da gamba in the Baroque period, or a violin. So he is the god of stringed instruments. So Orpheus gets this stringed instrument from his dad, Apollo. And Orpheus has this extraordinary capacity with his music to bring harmony to the world, the theme that we explored with Pythagoras, right? This theme of harmony, that he is actually, according to the myths, not only to make savage beasts tame, he's actually able to divert rivers from their sources, to actually change nature all around him through the playing of his music. Now, the most famous and influential myth of Orpheus is that he too lost the feminine. Just as what we saw with Demeter and Persephone, the myth of Orpheus that has permeated throughout culture, that began the birth of opera, is that Orpheus was to marry his beloved bride Eurydice. And on the day of their wedding, she was bitten. By what? By a snake. Remember that snake theme? She is bitten by a snake, and she dies. And Orpheus is so grief-stricken, that he just cannot bear it. And so he decides that if she is dead, he will want to join her. And he goes down into the world. He finds an entrance into the underworld. And he descends all the way to the throne of Hades and Persephone. And there he plays. You can see here, this is more of the stringed instrument. So here he plays his song of grief and lamentation. He pours his heart out. And even the gods are moved to tears. There's these wonderful tellings that, Sisyphus, who is chained on the rock, who's always having his guts plucked out by the eagle stops doing it because he's moved by the music. That's Prometheus. And Sisyphus, who's pushing the rock up the hill, suddenly stops by the power of the music. The world changes. And that Hades, the lord of the underworld himself, has tears pouring down his face. So Hades and Persephone say, all right, you can have your bride back. Hermes will escort you from the underworld on this 3-day journey back to life. 3-day journey back to life. And when they arrive, there's just one little catch, though. And the catch is that they can't look back, that Orpheus cannot look back at her. So here's this wonderful image. Here's the lyre itself, and they're going through the underworld with the shadowy shade figures in the backdrop. And he's trying not to look at her. Now, it's fascinating to note how myths change and evolve over time. And it seems as if in the earliest versions of this myth, they actually made it. They got out, and it was happily ever after. But that didn't make a good enough story for some people, apparently, because as the mythology developed, the one that ended up having the most traction and the biggest hold in the world is that they get to the very end. She's like, look at me, sweetheart, look at me. No, I'm not going to look at you. They get to the very end of this cave as they're about to come out, and just as he gets into the light, he turns and basically says, sweetie, we made it. But she's still there. And so he loses her again. There are many variants on this, and some of them he just becomes filled with doubt and he turns, and others he hears this sharp noise. There's so many versions of the Orpheus story, but ultimately what happens is after this journey to find his beloved, to rescue the lost feminine, he loses her again. And this time his grief is so intense that the only way that he can find, that he can bear life, is by again pouring his heart into music, to creating songs of grief and lamentation. And now, he also turns to other stories, to other myths, to the myth of the dismembered god. And according to many of the mythologies, then, Orpheus at this point, though he is the son of Apollo, now turns to the god Dionysus to reform the Dionysian religion. The Dionysian religion had been meeting underneath the moon in the wilds, dismembering things, ripping raw animals apart and devouring them with blood dripping down underneath the moon. And now Orpheus as a figure and the Orphic religion is about holding this tension of the opposites. So instead of ripping apart raw animals and eating their flesh, they become a very symbolic religion in which they are going to commune with the spirit of Dionysus by drinking not blood, but wine. And they pour it into a goblet. And now they become a very ascetic sect that never drinks except when they're at the altar. And when they drink this goblet of wine, they feel like they are united with the spirit of Dionysus. The Orphic religions, we're going to continue to explore Dionysus next week, really emerge around the 6th century BC, the same time that Pythagoras is working and writing. And many people wonder if that split in the Pythagoreans, the ones that were the mathematikoi, studying the mathematics part of it, and then the acousmata that was more into the religious rites, if those in some ways were the Apollo side and the Dionysus side of one community. It's a possibility. There are other myths of Orpheus later that he ultimately turns his back again on Dionysus and returns back to Apollo. And in this myth, when he does that, he is ripped apart by the followers of Dionysus. He is dismembered just as the god Dionysus had been dismembered. So here are the Maenads, also known as the Bacchantes, those wild women followers of Dionysus, and they're attacking Orpheus, and just the way the Titans had ripped apart Dionysus, Orpheus is attacked and dismembered. Here's Moreau's depiction of Orpheus's head. And I love this detail, and please think about taking this not literally, but symbolically. Because the story goes that even after he was dismembered, his head began to float to the island of Lesbos, where the poets lived, where the great poet Sappho, who was a Pythagorean, lived. And the head floated down, and while the head was floating in the water, it still sang. It still sang. It kept singing. It kept singing, and it was enshrined in an oracle until God, Apollo, came and took him and rested him in peace in the stars, where when you look up, you will see the constellation Lyra, after Lyre, after Apollo's son who played the lyre. Now just think about this. For the Pythagoreans, looking up, they see the pattern of the stars, and it's a mirror of all of myth, all of cosmology. Now, I invite you to consider the depth of this myth. What does it mean to keep singing no matter what? Even when your heart is broken, even when you are in the depth of grief, even when you are utterly dismembered, to keep singing. This is why the myth of Orpheus is the most important myth in all of classical music. It becomes the genesis for the birth of opera at the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Baroque era. The first 3 out of 4 operas are all on the story of Orpheus. I have lost count how many operas ever since then have been the myths of Orpheus. And even for composers who did not write an opera, this story was front and center in their minds. Franz Liszt describes Beethoven's 4th piano concerto as Orpheus's descent into the underworld. It is the dominant myth. No matter what happens, keep singing. If you are in the depths of grief, sing. If you are in the heights of joy, sing. Keep letting your song come out. And we see this theme over and over and over again then in the lives of musicians like Mozart, like Beethoven, who have been described as being incarnations of Orpheus. Profoundly important myth. Now, the other aspect of Orpheus, not unlike Pythagoras we talked about last time, was that healing capacity, the healing through music that was so important. And one of the things that Orpheus was said to have done then is through the power of his song to bring together the world that would have torn itself apart, to let the lion and the lamb come together. One of Orpheus's titles was the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd. So we see here in this image him playing the lyre, and there are one set of animals that represent the wildness of nature, and the others, the little lambs, that represent the domesticated part of nature. The 2 polarities, again, the Apollonian, Dionysian, coming together. Orpheus then, with his lyre, with the sheep at his feet, Orpheus as the Good Shepherd, is an image that proliferates in the ancient world, particularly in the years 300 BC to 300 AD. And we find Roman sarcophagi carved with this image of Orpheus as the Good Shepherd. One of the most fascinating things for me about art history is to note that the image that most of us associate with Christianity of a man on a cross, the crucifix image, was not the dominant image of Christianity until the year 1000. Before that, there were other images that proliferated and dominated, and one of those was the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. But sometimes that Good Shepherd has some surprising elements, such as in the catacombs where the earliest Christians in Rome worshipped. If you go to those catacombs of Rome, you will find images of Christ with a harp, with a lyre, because early Christians saw Jesus as this paradoxical figure who united the tension of the opposites, who brought harmony to the world, who enabled the lion and the lamb, as in the words of the book of Revelation, to lie down together. So if we're looking at art history, we'll find fascinating things. We'll see these artistic symbols, the Orpheus mosaic of the 2nd century with the harp, the Good Shepherd fresco in the catacombs of Priscilla from the 3rd century of Rome. In those catacombs here, notice that the figure of Christ actually has little pipes that were associated with Pan, the Pan pipes, the musical instruments that were all associated with the ancient Greek world. I invite us to remember that the Hebrew father, the Jewish father of Christianity, had a ban on sacred images. The sacred images come from the Greek imagination, the Greek mother coming together. And where did they turn for their images? They turned primarily, in many cases, to the myth of Orpheus. The myth of Orpheus, the reconciler of worlds, this human who's begotten of a divine father. So here's another image from Jerusalem from the 5th century. And this one, Jesus playing a harp. And notice the little figures that are around it. They're little pan figures. They've got their little goat hooves. They've got their little horns. They would be the companions of Dionysus. Jesus surrounded by satyrs holding a harp. Here is Orpheus and the animals then. The exact same sort of vision. Christ the Good Shepherd in Ravenna, over and over. Now that theme of the descent into the underworld and the return to the upper world is, of course, also the story of Jesus. And after his suffering and death, it was said that he then descended into the underworld. The oldest creed in the Christian creed talks about going down into the underworld for those days. And in this story, this is the image of Fra Angelico, then he bursts down the door. I always love this image because it's like Wile E. Coyote underneath the door. It's this little demon that went squish. And then he liberates the citizens of the underworld to return. That myth was prefigured in the myth of Dionysus, who also, it is said, before his marriage to Ariadne, descended into the underworld to get back his mother, Semele, and to bring her up from the underworld. Notice that this image by Fra Angelico here is of Jesus resurrected. And what do we have as the central symbol behind him? It's the egg. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the resurrected life is symbolized by a what color egg? A red egg. You give red eggs on Easter as a symbol that relates to a myth of Mary Magdalene, that after the events of the crucifixion, she went to complain about the handling of the trial and Pontius Pilate. And she went before the Emperor Tiberius, and she told the story, and he said to her, that could no more happen than this egg turn red. And according to the myths and tradition, the egg turned red. And so we have all of these icons of Mary Magdalene holding the red egg, which is the same story as the birth of new life out of the Greek Orphic tradition, that the egg begins to glow red, burst its bounds from the serpent, and from that all new life emerges. That theme of new life and the egg we find as a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. It's what the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung would call an image that's in our collective unconscious. You know, we all know so much about our physical DNA. You know, you can go get your chromosomes mapped and know exactly what country that your ancestors came from. But Jung believed, and I agree with him, that we also have a DNA of our imagination. And he calls this the archetypal world, the symbol sets. And just as we each have biological signatures, there is something in our DNA of our imagination that emerges in stories and symbols and myths over and over and over again, which accounts for the reason why Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic, and Native American shamans have had the same visions. Black Elk and Hildegard of Bingen saw the same things. They described the same images. We see some of these same currents, whether it's in Greek 6th century life or in the emergence of Christianity. The symbols are there. They're there in the DNA imagination. And it's a fascinating thing to go through this process of spiritual archaeology to see this emerge, to see how that plays out. The Eleusinian mysteries that eventually flourished and were such an essential part of ancient Greek life. For 2,000 years, it was said that there was this journey in which pilgrims would arrive at Eleusis and undergo a process that would prepare them so that they would no longer fear death. And that process was a process we know very little bit about because it was kept in greatest secrecy. There are certain signifiers that we can know. There are certain symbols that we can follow. And we know that at its height, there was something that happened, something that was shown, something that was seen, something that was heard. And it was signified by the birth of a divine child. That was said to have changed the world for anybody who encountered that. The divine child was said to have been Persephone's giving birth to baby Dionysus. Dionysus, the thrice-born god. And we find that echo in also the words of Jesus when he said, "You must be born again of water and spirit." Parallel stories, parallel themes. The Gospel of Thomas, one of those texts that was written in the first centuries, that was rediscovered in the caves of Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, after languishing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, was a text that the psychologist Carl Jung thought that came from communities that were amazing seekers of wisdom, what he called the so-called Gnostics. And there's this one line in there that I love, and it says, "Seek until you find, and when you find, you shall be disturbed. And when you are disturbed, then you shall rule over all." This is a myth that can often disturb people. But the word disturb, I might consider to be shaking up, to shake us up a little bit so that we can open our eyes a little wider, so that we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Mythology claims that myths are stories that may never have happened, but are always true, are always true. So I'm going to invite you to consider this question. We've touched on very briefly, just the tip of the iceberg, these themes that shaped the entire ancient Greek world and that sent echoes throughout the centuries that we still have, whether it's FTD Florist Man or Christianity itself. And these echoes and these themes, I'm going to invite you to ask the question for yourself, this story of dismemberment, and then being remembered by searching into the depths and bringing out the lost feminine. How does that touch you in your life? What does that say to you? What have been the paradoxes that you have encountered, this tension of the opposites that Orpheus points to and that early Christianities thought that Jesus embodied? Son of a virgin, child of a god, the good shepherd who leads us into harmony. How in your own life have you known paradox? How have you needed to go into the underworld to bring up something that had been lost in order to have new life? And how might we now, in our culture, be in need of descending and finding the lost feminine? Thank you very much.